Bienvenidos, damas y caballeros. Today, we will be rewriting the storied and rich Historia de nuestra madre patria, España. This video will ask the question, what if the House of Austria survived and continued to lead Spain into the 18th century? Well, that's what we will be doing today. But first, don't forget to like the video, comment down below, and subscribe for more content. Introductions out of the way. Santiago y Sierra, España. Let us begin with a brief recap of the 16th and 17th century. Spain, as we know it, was comprised of multiple kingdoms. The Kingdom of Castile, the Kingdom of Aragon, the Kingdom of Navarra, and the Kingdom of Granada. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, reconquered Granada from the Mohammedans in 1492. At the same time, Christopher Columbus discovers the New World and thus launches Spain and Europe into the Age of Discovery. The Kingdom of the Spains, Las Españas, became a first-rate global power. The Hispanic monarchy, after the death of Isabella and Ferdinand, fell unto the Spanish Habsburgs, the House of Austria, in which a golden age ensued. Advances in law, medicine, society, the sciences, economic strides, culture, the arts, military victories, etc. were made, and Spain became the center of the world. But wars and societal degeneracy, both political and social, on top of religious strife and humanist beliefs with propaganda smear campaigns, such as the Black Legend, starts to affect the empire at the beginning of the 17th century. By the time of the birth of Charles II, King of the Spains, the empire was on the back foot and in quote-unquote decline. However terrible the situation was for the young king, his reign started at the age of 4. After pressures from both his ministers and his mother, Charles reigned as a personal monarch. He delegated affairs of state to his half-brother and to other capable ministers, starting the process to introduce reforms. These reforms largely worked, but by the time of his death, the empire was still stagnant. His first wife died from poisoning, which I will assume to be canon in our timeline and in this video, and he was forced to remarry. Not being able to produce an heir, Charles underwent treatments and exorcisms, which were both unsuccessful, which further damaged his health and allowed opportunists to weasel in. Nearing his death and having other European powers dividing his empire, Charles, in a last act of defiance, signed his will that the Duke of Anjou, Philip V, would inherit his kingdom, plunging Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession. This war would be devastating, most of all to Spain, as she would lose territories, lose prestige, and have the Bourbon move in. This is the world in which our timeline is canon. Now, let's fix that. We begin in 1690, where King Charles II defies all odds and has a child with his wife, Marie Louise. Marie gives birth to a daughter, with her name being Isabella María Luisa Teresa Josefina de la Inmaculada Concepción de Austria y España, or Isabella María Luisa Teresa Josefina de la Inmaculada Concepción de Austria y España. However, to not diverge too much, as that will happen later in the video, Marie-Louise still dies shortly after giving birth, and Charles is heartbroken. They hold a funeral and mass prayers are said for the king and the Infanta's health. Now that Charles has an heir, there is no need to force him to remarry nor undergo any extreme treatments and exorcisms to produce an heir. Thus, his health remains mostly well, given his state, and continues to implement reforms whilst educating his daughter. He does fight with his ministers and advisors to form a small council to educate the Infanta should her father pass. But otherwise, Charles continues to rule and educate until the end of his days. In 1695, Charles betroths his daughter to the heir to the House of Wittelsbach, Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. In doing so, he secures Spain's independence from either Habsburgs or Bourbons and brings Bavaria under Spanish influence, giving them allies in Europe. This also teaches the Infanta to make allies that support Spain and not to put the empire second in any negotiations. Some nobles tried to rise up and challenge the king, with support from either Bourbon backers or Habsburg backers, to wrangle control of the Infanta from the king. However, the loyalists, with papal backing, are able to quell the rebellions. It is during this time when the reforms started to bear fruit and Spain begins to recover. 1697. The Treaty of Ryswick concludes the 9 Years' War, or the War of the Grand Alliance, and still remains mostly unchanged. Charles's health starts to decline here, first slowly, and the other powers in Europe see this and start preparations for another war. Charles sets up a regency council to govern until his daughter comes of age. Maximilian Emmanuel still is the governor of the Spanish Netherlands and starts preparations for war and increasing the defense of the area. 1699 is another change in our timeline, as Joseph Ferdinand does not die in our timeline, and he will continue to lead a normal life for the rest of the video. He studies under his father to learn about the art of war and diplomacy. The big year of 1700. We still have Charles, with his declining health, finally passing in November on All Saints' Day. Here we see that Louis XIV of France takes a gamble and invades the Spanish Netherlands to finally conquer it. However, a coalition of England, the Habsburgs, the Dutch Republic, and Spain are able to halt France's advances and grind the war to a halt. In 1705, the war with France has ended and the status quo remains. The Infanta comes of age and is proclaimed and recognized as Queen of the Spains. During her coronation ceremony, the Queen reaffirms her ancestral lands and territories lost during her father's time. Then she and her husband take the steps necessary to rebuild and improve the realm, be it economic, military, and diplomatic, with the Spaniards' primary objective to take out the Dutch Republic while strengthening the country. Hence, more reforms are planned in the coming year as war is on the horizon. 1707. The military is reformed and emphasis is put on hit-and-run tactics, repurposing the army into one where it can perform multiple tasks that keeps them self-sufficient and focuses on Fabian tactics to demoralize the enemy army and to provoke a death by 1,000 cuts strategy. This allows a more efficient use of the army, keeping costs low while still maintaining army effectiveness. Ecclesiastical reforms are also introduced to help the societal bonds and to export the Trenton reforms abroad. Secret alliances are formed with the HRE and Habsburgs to have more focus on the Dutch Republic and the French. The Spanish economy finally recovers from the ceaseless wars during the last century. An alliance with Bavaria is also formed, putting pressure on both the Habsburgs and on France. Naval reforms and public works are also introduced and done. In 1715, there is a Jacobite uprising that the Spanish support financially and send some armed forces to assist the Jacobites. The ensuing conflict erupts between Great Britain and Spain exclusively. The Spanish Navy and British Navy duke it out, where the British are not able to land a decisive victory. This allows the Spanish army to land in Ireland and defeat the British with the help of the Jacobites. Thus, the British finally seek peace to prevent a further invasion of the mainland. The peace treaty frees Ireland and sees the restoration of the Stuarts to dominion over Ireland. As thanks, alliances and marriages are proposed along with trade agreements, further strengthening ties with the Stuarts. This little war shocks the other European powers. The Dutch and the French are worried and both seek alliances with the British, with Spain threatening the balance of power. Author's note here, it is also around this time that the Queen and King start to have issues. 1719 is an interesting year. A war of the quadruple alliance style breaks out as Spain takes on the Dutch Republic, Great Britain, and France to regain control of the entirety of the Spanish Netherlands. Initially, it was a 3v1 against Spain, and thanks to her military reforms, she manages to keep the coalition, all three forces, at bay, although offense isn't off the ground yet. The Dutch Republic, being the main objective, desperately tries to sabotage and bribe their way to victory, but their attempts bear little fruit. Being in an economic decline, it is only a matter of time until they are conquered. The French fare better than the other powers, pushing into Spanish lands, but their advances are halted and they are on the defensive. Meanwhile, the British are supporting both powers financially and logistically, but their ability to do so is being hampered by the Spanish Navy. Thus, Spain is slowly defeating her enemies piecemeal, although not without some difficulty, as their trade ships are under attack and their troops are malnourished. However, a few key victories solidifies her resolve to continue to the end. The year is 1721, and the war has been going on for a couple years now. And soon the Stuarts, seeing the stalemate, sense an opportunity to attack, so they join the Spanish and do their best to invade Scotland. This does catch the British off guard, as they are forced to reposition in order to save their island possessions. Then, with a surprise and successful attack on the French by the Spaniards, the Habsburgs and the HRE finally decides to intervene. This tips the scales of war in Spain's favor, as the French sue for peace. This inevitably leads to Spain finally invading and destroying the Protestant Dutch Republic, who for so long have antagonized the Spanish. This ends the War of the Spanish Netherlands. The following peace treaty sees Spain regain the entirety of the Spanish Netherlands, both from France and from the Dutch Republic, or former Dutch Republic. Spain also reconfirms her Burgundian lands, as France is forced to recognize Spain's claim to them and forced to pay her reparations. The British also pay reparations to both Spain and the Stuarts, weakening them economically, paving the road to internal strife. As the peace treaty is confirmed, Queen Isabella enters The Hague triumphantly, reaffirming her rights to rule and gives concessions to the population as to expedite the peace and integration processes. The persecution of the church ceases, and she resumes her rebuilding efforts in the region. By now, Spain is becoming the true terror of the Protestants, and this marks the beginning of the Spanish ascendancy into global hegemony. 1726 comes around, and Joseph Ferdinand's father passes from natural causes, and he is succeeded by his son, who is the king consort of Spain, and thus joins Bavaria into a personal union with Spain. This move alarms the powers of Europe again, as the Habsburgs now have a potential rival on their doorstep. However, the Queen's diplomatic prowess reassures her family, and a new accord is reached where the Spanish, Bavarian, and Habsburgs divide Europe into their own spheres of influences, and both form alliances through marriages and trading rights. Then Spain spends time and effort into consolidating lands, reforming the empire, and spending money into developing infrastructure, agriculture, industry, and political reforms. Meanwhile, the enemies of Spain keep growing and growing, as both France and Great Britain include powers such as Russia and Prussia. In 1729, the British, along with the French, declare war on Spain, landing troops into Ireland and blockading the Low Countries. France invades from the west into the Spanish Netherlands and the south into southern Germany, taking on Spain and Bavaria. However, Spain is able to halt the French advance, whilst formulating an invasion plan of England. The French do advance quite far, but they fall into a trap and are cut off from their supply trains, further demoralizing the army. Meanwhile, the British do have initial successes at sea and on land, but they cannot get a decisive victory. By 1733, the British managed to take all of Ireland, almost capitulating the Stuarts. But the War of the Polish Succession kicks off, causing British forces to redeploy elsewhere. Habsburgs and Austria are fighting the Prussians, while Spain beats up France and Britain, and the Bavarians assist the Austrians. Prussia is unable to overcome the Austrian-Bavarian-Spanish coalition and is defeated. France defeats Spain in a decisive battle, but are forced to retreat with a joint invasion on the horizon. The Stuarts are able to retake Ireland, defeating the British with guerrilla tactics. Both Great Britain and France convince Russia to join in the war and are successful, causing the Austrians and the Bavarians to divert their forces. By 1735, the War of the Polish Succession comes to an end, and the Habsburgs are able to take the throne in Poland, adding another power to the growing Spanish alliance. Russia is able to exit the war with minor concessions. Finally, a renewed push into France allows for peace talks to begin. The Spanish Navy is also able to defeat the British at sea, and fearing an invasion, the British also ask for peace. The resulting peace conference sees the Stuarts regain Scotland. The Bavarians get the territories of Alsace-Lorraine from France and are given suzerainty over southern Germany. Austria takes Silesia and breaks apart Prussia, and then forms alliances with Poland, giving them some Prussian lands in order to strengthen the bonds. Spain is the real victor here, and as such goes for the gamble, retaking the Burgundian lands as she inherited them, solidifies her territories in the Spanish Netherlands, taking lands around them, loosely form the old kingdom of Lotharingia, along with Bavaria. Spain also has unchallenged suzerainty over northern Italy. All of this changes the balance of power in Europe, leaving Spain as the unrivaled power in the West. But Spain has to spend time putting down revolts, reforming her provinces to integrate them, and to ensure a lasting peace. Her defenses across the European possessions are improved, and the economy does struggle to recover, but the small peace keeps it from going bankrupt. France and Great Britain are now second-rate powers, and they join Russia to form a new coalition against Spain and her allies. The year 1740 sees the War of the Austrian Succession kick off and sees the remaining powers in Europe rally around Russia to liberate them from the Spanish Habsburg hegemony. Needless to say, Spain joins Austria and the Habsburgs to defend their homelands and also to keep the Russians at bay, and heads into the war on the offensive side for once, attacking France. The Spanish Navy, battle-hardened and battle-tested, takes on both Great Britain and France and their respective navies, winning some battles and losing others. Russia invades Poland and pushes to Austria, while Bavaria goes into northern Germany, reinforces Alsace-Lorraine. Spain sends aid to both Austria and Poland, which helps to halt the Russian advance. In 1741, Sweden decides to join the war and attacks Russia, thus forcing Russia to come to peace talks. With Russia suing for peace, the other powers are also driven to peace. The peace treaty maintains the status quo. Maria Theresa is still the Archduchess, and she decides to cast her lot with Spain, seeing the failure of the other powers to remove her. Now Europe gears up for another confrontation, so each nation goes and works on their domestic policies in preparation for an upcoming war. Finally, we get to a point where our timeline and this alternate timeline truly diverge. Up until now, events have gone mostly or partially the way our timeline occurred. But after this year, they take on a new direction. The year is 1744, and in our timeline, this conflict would be called the 7 Years' War. This kicks off as Great Britain, France, and Russia all declare war on Spain and her allies in order to restore the old order. This happens 12 years before our timeline, and for different reasons too, and will be explained in detail in the following sentences. For now, the war rages all around the globe and ends 7 years later in 1751. The 7 Years' War and their events are summarized as follows. War is declared on Spain by Great Britain, France, and Russia, and soon after, Spain's allies join her. Spain takes the initiative and invades France. Bavaria is tasked to invade and hold Germany, and Austria/the Habsburgs and Poland are said to take on Russia. Soon, Great Britain, wanting to split Spanish attention, successfully bribes Portugal to invade Spain, halting the Spanish advances into France and causing them to focus on Portugal instead. In the New World, colonial and vice-regal governments also join in on the conflicts, with a joint invasion of Florida, Mexico, and the Caribbean by a combined Anglo-French force. Sometime shortly afterwards, the Swedes and even the Ottomans join against the Spanish Axis. Things are looking bleak with the French, the British, the Russian, the Swedes, and the Ottomans applying pressure on all sides on different continents. By 1743, the war looks like it'll be the end of the Spanish hegemony. However, a decisive battle was needed, and one happens at sea, with a Spanish victory coming in clutch. This allows communication and supply lines to be virtually cut between the Old World and the New World, and allows for a blockade of the British Isles. The British and French forces, cut off in the New World, and they're already not working well together, continue to launch attempts into the Spanish territories, but are disorganized and demoralized, and they ultimately fail after some initial successes. New Spain is thus able to retaliate, sending the enemy forces back home, recapturing lost territory, and making a push into enemy territory, with two fronts, one pushing through the Mississippi Valley and the other along the eastern seaboard, going for a scorched earth policy from New Orleans and Georgia to Montreal and New York. Back in Europe, the British are facing rebellions and invasions from the Stuarts, which so far they are able to keep at their borders, and are fearful of a Spanish invasion force. The Spanish Navy can now fight off the Ottomans, halting any advances in the Mediterranean, and does assist in alleviating Poland to take on both Russia and Sweden. Austria is said to take on Russia, stabilizing the Eastern Front before tackling the Ottomans as well. Bavaria is able to take over Germany, moves in to invade Denmark before finally crossing into Sweden, opening two fronts on them. Spanish provinces in the New World tackle Brazil and any other Portuguese possession in the West and East Indies, while sending reinforcements to Spain. This gives Spain the much-needed push to fight back and conquer Portugal. This event marks the beginning of the end for the losing side, as Spain is now able to focus her attention and re-invading France with Bavarian support, taking Paris 2 years after the decisive Battle of the Sea. Great Britain is overwhelmed and now isolated, falls in due time, and the other powers, after intense fighting, agree to peace talks. The Austrians and the Spanish are putting pressure on the Ottomans in the Balkans, while the Bavarians and the Polish take on the Swedes. Peace talks finally start, and the fighting is ceased. Since their beginning in 1750, the peace talks in Rome took time, but they officially end and are ratified in 1751. Starting with the Queen of the World, Spain takes southern France and northeastern France. She takes over France's colonial possessions, kicking her out of the New World entirely. Spain is also able to install a royal family member on the Portuguese throne after their king dies, bringing them closer to Spain. Spain also helped the Stuarts ascend the throne, taking over the British Isles and making them permanent allies of Spain. Italy, save for the Papal States, is consolidated to Spain. Austria takes large chunks of the Balkans, growing a lot in size, and a union between the houses of Habsburg and Wittelsbach. Bavaria finishes gobbling up the rest of the Germanies and is proclaimed the eternal head of the HRE. Poland takes land back and strengthens the borders against both Sweden and Russia. Finally, all powers agree that the religion of Europe is codified as Catholicism, and trade and borders are drawn up. All powers involved sign off on the treaty, and peace is restored. Spain and her allies now have dominion over Europe, and Spain has dominion over the world. After the Treaty of Rome, 1751, Spain now has the arduous task of implementing reforms, putting down revolts, and expanding economic policies and industrial capabilities. Investment into the arts, the sciences, and politics, as well as ecclesiastical reforms. She also funds military expeditions into the Far East, looking for avenues of trade and conquest. North Africa and the rest of the Islamic world is also on the agenda. Public works and infrastructure and new technologies help to solidify Spain as the world hegemon. By 1760, the Queen's health is declining, and like her father, she receives the last rites and proclaims her will. Shortly after Easter 1760, the Queen passes on to her eternal reward, succeeded by her eldest son, who takes on the title of Dominus Mundi, Lord of the World. Elaborate coronation rituals and titles are bestowed. The king spends the rest of his days upholding justice and the laws, sending military excursions into new lands, carrying out reforms, and is the patron of the arts and the sciences. He gives to the poor and personally rules over his land, and his power is equal to that of the HRE. His lands include most of West and Central Europe, the Americas, the West and East Indies. From here, there are planned invasions of Japan, China, and Africa, with settlers, missionaries, and soldiers being sent to all edges of the known world to civilize, evangelize the world. Thus, we reach the end of our video. Was this an accurate portrayal of the events that could potentially unfold? Maybe. Is this a really pro-Spanish retelling of history? Maybe. Am I satisfied with the result? Yes. This video was a fun little idea that had been floating around my noggin for some time. And now I can live out my fantasy of watching my ancestors rise to prominence once more. Because, in alternate history, there's usually two approaches. One is, what if ancient power survived? Or two, what if the Nazis win? This, I feel like, is a unique approach to things, because could Charles II have produced an heir capable of keeping the empire alive? Maybe. Would that heir fail? Maybe. Would Spain reemerge as a global hegemon? Maybe. This is, to me, a perfect opportunity to do an alternate history video on, simply because each possibility can occur. There isn't, by the time Charles dies, 15 years later, Louis XIV dies too. The Dutch are out of the picture 30 years later. The 70 Years' Wars in 1753. We have Jacobite uprisings and all the like. And, any one of these things could have tipped the balances of power back into the Spanish fold. Great Britain was on the ascendancy in this period. France was declining in this period, or at least in the 1700s. Austria, Prussia, Russia, Poland, Sweden, all these things are happening at the same time. So it's very likely that Spain, had Charles had an heir, would have survived more or less intact, and potentially could have reconquered their possessions and the world. Again, potentially they would have failed. In the background section of this video, I say, quote, they are declining, but it's not in decline. The Spanish Empire reaches its apex under their Bourbon. So it's definitely possible. Hence why I made this video. But yes, I do have a very, very pro-Spanish outlook on things. So if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. But I still try to ground it in some basic reality, such as Great Britain, no matter what, will always support a side that challenges the status quo or challenges future hegemons. France is being surrounded, so it has to attack in order to keep its sovereignty. The Dutch get wiped out. That's it. And then Russia wants to go into Poland and Eastern Europe and take stuff there. And the Ottomans, they're on the decline by this time. So sure, any chance at recapturing stuff is needed. Same with Sweden as well. So to me, this is like a sort of beautiful opportunity. That being said, that is all. Vuestros Mercedes. Viva Cristo Rey. Arriba España. Adelante España.